Today I'm going to share with you a story about how telling people about my YouTube channels genuinely ruined my life 3 times. You'll hear a lot of YouTubers saying, don't tell people how much money you have, or don't tell people you have a YouTube channel. And that usually comes from a place of real entrepreneurs don't talk about doing it, they just go out and hustle and grind and, all of that crap. But my perspective is different. The first time YouTube ruined my life was when I was 12 years old and just starting out in high school. I was pretty popular until I started making YouTube videos. In 2011, me and my friends were obsessed with Freddie W. The idea that just a couple of random dudes could act out and edit together a really professional looking action sequence was just beyond cool. So I enlisted a couple of my mates who liked acting and movies, and we set out to create short films inspired by things like the Bible passage scene in Pulp Fiction and the train scene in The Matrix. The problem was, we didn't have any money, and we couldn't afford fake guns, so we used Nerf guns instead because almost every kid had one just lying around. We made 3 or 4 videos over the summer and posted them on YouTube and told a few friends in our class about it because we were just so excited to have people to tell. And that all worked out fine. For about 24 hours. News of our channel had leaked across the school, and now everywhere we went, kids would run up to us shouting, "Nerf gun losers and Nerf nerds, pew pew!" You know how it goes. Just the standard genius 12-year-old insults. And because we had, hand-to-hand combat sequences in the videos, people started challenging us to fights, or would push or punch us randomly at school to start a school brawl. At the same time, Facebook was popping off, and people would comment on my posts or photos. Here's an actual screenshot of one of the comments I found whilst looking through the absolute horror show that was my Facebook in 2011 and 2012. So, I'm a pretty hard-headed person, so I was never really upset by the roasting we got, but it was a real problem because not only was I physically not safe in school anymore, some of my friends were actually afraid to be seen publicly with me and started distancing themselves from me. That behaviour lasted a full year of high school, so I was pretty isolated during that time. Now, I had friends outside of school for the various sports I did, like football, taekwondo, cross-country, table tennis, and all that kind of stuff, and they didn't care about any of the Nerf gun nonsense, so it wasn't like my entire world was falling down. Just the 50% or so of my time awake that was spent at school, which was legitimately ruined. Oh, and any time I tried to play COD or FIFA, since all of my gaming crews were from school. Okay, so maybe more than 50% of my life was ruined. Anyway, it took a long time to rebrand and rebuild my reputation into something that people were okay associating with, and because I was consciously making an effort to do that, in my 12-year-old brain, that meant I had to drop interests I had for true passions, like acting and creating YouTube videos. So I gave up and didn't post another YouTube video for 7 years. Now, if you're in school now, chances are you're inspired by a particular YouTuber or TikToker, and that drives you to want to make videos, and I would absolutely encourage you to do so. But if you do, make it a solo project, and don't put your name on it. This way, there's no chance anyone finds it until you're already successful, and at that point people will just be really impressed with how famous you are. When I started posting YouTube videos again, I was 19 and in uni, and telling my uni friends was fine because it had 0 impact on them, and they're all grown-ups, so nobody cared, and nobody made a big deal out of it. But telling my family was a little bit messy, because after telling my brother, who's about 2 years older than me, and also a cheap bastard, he grossly exaggerated how much I was making to my parents, and insisted they should stop paying my monthly food expenses and give it to him instead. I shit you not, that is what he constituted as fair. Anyway, this created a very weird family situation where my parents didn't really know how to treat us equally, since we were both in university, but I technically didn't really need any financial support anymore. We eventually agreed that I would still get enough money to pay my food bill, which was about $50 a week, until I finished university. Meanwhile, my parents would pay my brother's living expenses for many more years to come, but that's a different story for another day. Anyway, that was not the second time that YouTube ruined my life. The second time was when I started working in investment banking, and what started as a blessing became an almost career-ending quagmire. Let me explain. When I was applying to graduate jobs, I wanted to stand out on my resume, so I mentioned that I'd grown a bunch of different YouTube channels to almost 6 figures annually and gotten millions of views a month. Now, in 2020, and especially to the older generation in the corporate world, this was incredibly bizarre and strange to them, so every interview I went to, I got multiple questions on it, which was great because it meant that I was differentiating myself from all of the other candidates, most of which were just kind of copy-pastes of the same posh kid aspiring to be a finance bro. So this differentiation showed I had entrepreneurial drive, could manage teams of people, meet deadlines, and make money. So every interviewer would leave the room with a very unexpected impression of me, and they'd reflect positively on the session, since hopefully I was the one candidate who did not bore them with the same list of typical extracurricular activities, like being on the rugby team and being in your college's shadow investment fund society. This meant I got a ton of internship and graduate offers, and then once I was on my internship and word got around that I had a sort of side business, people took a lot of interest in me. So roundabout now, things are sounding incredibly positive, but it's about to take a terrible turn. So I flew through the internship and onto the graduate scheme and became known as the analyst with his own assistant, or the YouTube guy. Now, this reputation was something I tried to avoid because I hadn't actually broadcasted it once joining the bank what I was doing outside of the office. But the corporate grapevine of gossip took full effect, and eventually everybody knew. So banking is a pretty strict industry, and the place I worked at had a very tight policy around outside interests, i.e. side hustles, side hoes.
Wait, first of all, you're not gonna speed past that like you didn't just say what you just said.
Really side anything that could even slightly be considered inappropriate or a conflict of interest. So when I started working there, I found out that any outside business I owned had to be fully disclosed to the bank and had to be approved by compliance in order for me to be allowed to carry on that business. But that wasn't the only problem. Being a regulated individual and posting on social media was a grey area due to some comically strict company policy and some weird regulation out of the US, which I was subjected to. So this presented a huge problem to me because I wasn't entirely comfortable with sharing some of the YouTube channels that I'd grown because let's be frank, a bunch of 60-year-old men in suits just wouldn't get the vibe. So I was at this really tricky crossroads where I obviously had to report this in order to get my YouTube business approved, but at the same time they might reject it and force me to stop, and if I didn't stop, I'd lose my job. So I thought about not disclosing it at all, but that was obviously not going to fly because a lot of people had already heard about it, and it was only a matter of time until someone from compliance slammed the ban hammer on me. So I strategically reported my business to the company by only referencing my core YouTube channels, which I thought they'd care about and accept. After a lot of back and forth, they eventually approved me to continue my YouTube business on the basis that none of those channels were financial related and none of them had my face on and couldn't be directly connected to me by anyone who found them. Again, that was great for about a year until I started applying to do 6-month rotations in another part of the business. So there was a weirdly informal process for this where you basically met with some of the juniors from the other teams, and then with some of the seniors from those teams, you had a casual chat with them, and if they vibed with you and thought you were reasonably competent, then you'd get an offer to join their team for a bit. So I met with some of the juniors in their team, and sure enough, the first thing they asked me was about YouTube, because they'd heard about it from the other analysts and they were curious. You know, you can't blame them. Now, given I didn't really know these people well, I adopted to indulge them because it would be rude or standoffish to just say, no, sorry, I don't feel comfortable talking about that. So I shared some high-level info with them and I answered all of their follow-up questions. And then we spoke about their team, the job, and that was that. I spoke to one of the seniors in the team, which seemed to go fine, and I waited to hear back to see if they'd accept me. Now, bear in mind, it was standard practice to accept people because doing a 6-month rotation was mandatory. With that being said, they initially rejected me and escalated the application to my team head, to which I was like, what? Essentially, the juniors had told their seniors that I was not serious about a career in banking and cared more about YouTube, and their rationale for that was that I spent most of our chat talking about it. Now, whilst the latter part of that is true, I only spoke about it because they asked me about it. And it certainly wasn't true that at that point in time that I cared more about YouTube than banking. Anyway, if that was true, I would never have started a career in banking in the first place because I was already making plenty of money from YouTube and didn't really need more money to live. So now my team thinks I don't know how to properly represent myself in an interview setting and need support on recalibrating my approach. I mean, what interview? I mean, we were told these were casual chats, not interviews. Guys, this supposed interview I had with other juniors was literally walking around a shopping centre with a cup of coffee in my hand. In what universe is that an interview? This was when I started to realise that the kind of games that the traditional corporate world play. When I raised this with other seniors in my team, they said I should have known to treat it like an interview since I didn't know them very well. Another absolutely insane statement. When you meet someone casually for the first time, do you act like you're being interviewed for a job? No, of course not, because that's completely unnatural human behaviour. Anyway, this team I applied for agreed to give me a second chance. Now, this time in the form of a traditional interview, to which I actually initially said no. Why would I want to do that when negative judgment had already been cast, and it's extremely hard to change someone's biased first impression of you, which you'll know if you read any of the psychological literature. Now, not to mention, my own impression of this team was now dwindling, considering what they'd done so far and what they'd said. At this point, my team head pointed out to me that if I didn't do the second interview, it would make me look weak and prove that I wasn't really interested in a career in banking. Like, what? I was already in a career in banking. This was a temporary rotation in a different team to expand my curiosity. So essentially, I was forced to do the second interview. I took it seriously, I presented myself in a more formal manner than I'm doing right now, and I thought it actually went pretty well. But for whatever reason, that team decided to reject me again, and the only reason they gave was that I wasn't a good fit. Whatever. This was a really bad look for me, as it would catch the attention of numerous seniors who like to gossip and juniors who knew I was applying to join that team. So your corporate image can be really fragile, and it doesn't really take much for it to completely shatter. After this, I had to spend a crazy amount of effort over the next 12 to 18 months working extra hard and avoid YouTube-related questions from people in order to maintain this idea that it wasn't a big deal and the company was my main focus. But that was a real blow to my career, and it cast doubt in leadership's mind about whether I should be considered for future promotions. My point is, if there's any way in which someone can weaponize knowledge that you give them about you, and there's no good way for you to combat and overcome that weaponization, do not arm people with that knowledge. So yeah, don't tell them what you're doing on YouTube or social media in general until it's already done, or it's to a point where you're protected from outside forces.